Hello, you're very welcome to this webinar on managing conflicts of interest in charities and other not-for-profit organisations. So this is the first in a series of free webinars for charity boards and committees and for those voluntary committees in other organisations as well. So the purpose of today is really to explain to you about conflicts of interest. In other words, what they are, how important they are, and how to deal with them when they arise. But just before we get started, a little bit about me. I'm Tony Harron. I am the owner of Admore Business Solutions, set up in 2004. I'm a former charity trustee, and I was the head of the finance subcommittee on that charity for about 8 years. So I did about 3 terms on that and felt that in line with good governance, 3 terms was sufficient on the board, and it was time to move on and let others have an opportunity to work and help support the charity's purposes. I'm also a former volunteer supervisor with a credit union. I worked in that role for 3 years, worked closely with the board on corporate governance and finance and audit type issues. I'm a chartered management accountant by profession. I deal with things like bookkeeping, business planning, that type of thing. So the 2 areas that I specialize in are really finance and corporate governance. And I've been a charity business advisor now for over 15 years. And my strong interest in finance and governance is really derived from my professional background and my personal experience working with charities. So, as I said, this is the first in a series of free webinars for charities and other not-for-profit organisations. And the way I'm going about these, I'm trying to condense quite difficult topics and quite complex topics into something bite-sized. So I'm going to run these webinars on the basis of 1 hour, during which the whole point is really to explain the concepts, explain the issues, and provide you with practical advice on how you can take things forward in your organisation. So I'll be looking at templates and case studies and things that you can touch and feel, because it's important to understand not just the principle of these issues, but the practical application of it. And that's where I think a lot of organisations fall down a little bit. They don't have the means and the wherewithal to understand how to implement some of the things that they come across. So I'm hoping that over the next series of webinars that you will pick up enough information to take into your organisation and to make some material change to what you're doing. So the webinars will be run on the last Wednesday of every month. As I say, they'll be bite-sized in 1 hour, and the next webinar in the series, webinar 2, will be managing risks, the essentials for voluntary boards. Quite closely linked to today's topic, and one that I think is really important, and one that I think voluntary boards sometimes struggle a little bit with, but I'll give you a stronger taste for that in terms of what's involved in that towards the end of this webinar. Okay, so what are we going to cover today? We are going to look at what are conflicts of interest, why are they so important, what happens when they go wrong. Really importantly, you need to understand what happens when conflicts of interest go wrong, because the consequences can be quite severe for your organisation if they do go materially wrong. And how should you deal with them? And that's really important. And that's part of the practical elements of today, that I'm going to show you techniques and things that you can do to use to control them, manage them, and deal with them when they do arise. And finally, I'm going to look at how they fit into the governance framework of an effective board. So in other words, you can take conflicts of interest as a topic as we are today, and you can deal with it as a standalone topic. And that's perfectly okay to do that, except that sometimes boards have a range of issues that they need to look at in terms of corporate governance and being more effective and getting things right. And I prefer to look at a solution to that involves taking a topic like conflicts of interest and putting it into context of all of the issues that a board needs to face. And I'll show you at the end of this webinar how you can go about doing that. So we'll kick off now with what are conflicts of interest. So here's a definition from the Charity Commission for England and Wales. And by the way, you will see different references to different sources of materials and templates and things, and you may be there and you may be working in a charity and you think they're entirely relevant. You may look and say, well, I'm based in Northern Ireland, or I'm in Scotland or Wales, or I'm in Republic of Ireland or somewhere else in the world, and you're saying that may not relate to me. But let me tell you, conflicts of interest is a common theme across all voluntary organizations. All voluntary boards face something like this and need to know how to deal with it. So it doesn't matter which of those organizations or where you're located, the principles of conflicts of interest are the same. So you might see a reference to certain sources and you might say, well, that's not quite our area. Go and look it up in your own area. So if you're based in Northern Ireland, if you're based in the Republic of Ireland, you look up your own charity regulator's website and you'll find something very similar to what I'm going to share. So basically, a conflict of interest is any situation in which a trustee's personal interests or loyalties could be seen to prevent them from taking a decision only in the best interest of the charity. And then to establish what I've been trying to explain, that the conflicts of interest basically are something that are common across different industries, different sectors. This is one from the Irish League of Credit Unions and their code of ethics. And basically, each director, supervisor, committee member, employee, and volunteer will avoid circumstances in which personal interests conflict or appear to conflict with the interests of the credit union or its members. And that's from the Irish League of Credit Unions Code of Ethics. So basically, there's two sources, and they all talk about the same type of thing when it comes to conflicts of interest. And you'll see that I've underlined on both of those quotations the two words personal interests. And it's important to understand what they are. So we'll just have a little look at those. What are personal interests? So again, this is from the Charity Commission of Northern Ireland this time. So different charity commissions have different quotations, different reference sources, but they all will be saying basically the same thing. So declarations should also be made of the direct and indirect pecuniary or monetary interests of close family members and of people living in the same household. So close family members include personal partners, parents, children, adult and minor, brothers, sisters, and the personal partners of any of these. So the definition of personal interests is beyond the individual who's on the board or in a senior management position. It's beyond that. It's actually anyone that person is connected to. So in my case on the board of the charity, my connections would be my family members and spouses of my family members. Why is that important? Because they're deemed to be issues that could conflict with the actual purpose and the role of an individual on the board. So all of the regulators and in fact some of the legal sources also extend the definition of personal interests beyond an individual. So there's one from the charity SORT. SORT is a statement of recommended practice, which is how the charity accounts are developed and made up. And basically they're formed from the Companies Acts and from charity rules and guidelines in terms of how they produce their accounts. So this says that a connected person means family, relatives, or business partners of a trustee, as well as businesses in which a trustee has an interest through ownership or influence. This term includes a trustee's spouse or unmarried or civil partner, children, siblings, grandchildren, and grandparents, as well as businesses where a trustee or family member holds at least 1/5 of the shareholding or voting rights. So very, very precise definitions here of what are deemed to be personal interests, and really important that as an individual, when you're reviewing an individual's interest, that you look at the broader picture, and I'll show you how that can be captured. A little reference here as well to the Section 88 of the Charities Act. This is Northern Ireland. Again, there's an England Charities Act. And I'll not go through all of this here, but basically you'll see that, again, it gets into very precise definitions of what a connected person is. And it talks about civil partners and wives and husbands and so on and so forth. It talks about people who are very close to the individual. And it's really important that in terms of dealing with this in your organization, you're aware of this broader definition. Okay, so I want to look at a couple of case studies because it's okay talking about conflicts of interest and what does that mean and trying to get your head around the whole concept of it and definitions. So what I'm going to do is just show you a couple of examples of where conflicts of interest have arisen, where they haven't been dealt with correctly, and where they've gone wrong. And basically, the outturning from that and the outcomes from that in terms of what happens when they go wrong. And the consequences can be quite severe. So I'm going to go through an example here, which is an example about a charity, a registered charity in England and Wales. And it was called the Alternative Animal Sanctuary. Concerns were raised by the auditor of the charity, and they were raised with the Charity Commission in England and Wales, and they undertook an investigation. So just a quick summary of the issues involved, and then I'll take you to the Charity Commission website and show you exactly how they dealt with it. So 8.1 million was raised between 2009 and 2015 through an external agency agreement. 0.9 million of that, so just 11% of that actually reached the charity. 7.2 million was taken in costs and fees by the agency. The chair of the charity received £2,000 a month from the charity in terms of rent for a property that they owned, and this wasn't documented. So the outturn from the investigation effectively was there was a lack of internal financial controls, there was no evidence of meetings, there was inadequate separation of personal and charity funds, and there was no conflicts of interest policy. So you can see in that simple summary there that there weren't things that weren't quite right in this charity. And finally, the charity, this is one of their findings, did not have a conflict of interest policy, and the trustees did not appear to recognise how to identify and manage such conflicts or the importance of doing so. Okay, so the point in this here is that it's really important to understand the A, what conflicts of interest are, B, how you track and manage them, and C, what happens when they go wrong. Because all of those matters are really important to the integrity and in fact, the reputational risk of your own organization. So I'm going to share with you now a link to the website in the Charity Commission here. So just bear with me, I'll get this up. Okay. Okay, so this is the charity inquiry, the Alternative Animal Sanctuary. This was published on the 2nd of September 2021. And you'll see it on the left-hand side. You can look at this yourself. You'll see it on the left-hand side that the you'll see that on the left-hand side, basically, that the contents of the report are published here in full view on the Charity Commission website. And you can see there that the headlines, if you like, are the charity itself, a little bit of background, the issues under investigation, the findings, the conclusions, the regulatory action taken, and issues for the wider sector. So there's a little bit of learning in this process of publicly, I feel like, disclosing all that they found and letting everybody see the implications of when things go wrong. So we'll just look at some of this here, because if I flick down through this, you'll see there's quite a lot of information here, quite a lot of detail. I'm not going to go through all this, of course, but you can see that there's a lot of information on the website here. And this is all public information that allows the Charity Commission to set out its stall and explain exactly what the, just bring this to the top again, exactly what the issues are in this charity. So I'll just go down through some of the headlines here. So what we have here is, I'll look at the issues under investigation. So they were 1, 2, 3, 5 of those. The first one was they had, well, it's the administration, governance and management of the charity, particularly the extent to which the trustees acted in the charity's best interests and acted in accordance with their legal duties. So really important that you understand that they're looking from a regulator's point of view as to how the charity is being managed. And you see that the third scope or item within the scope of their investigation was they needed to ensure the extent to which trustees ensure that conflicts of interest have been adequately avoided or managed. So they were specifically looking into whether these conflicts of interest that they felt existed within the charity, when certainly the concern was raised to the auditor, they were looking into seeing exactly how they were being managed in the charity. It's a very specific investigation. So if I go down into the findings now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but it's the conflicts of interest I want to focus on here. So if I go in here, it'll tell me under the heading, the extent to which the trustees ensured that conflicts of interest were adequately avoided or managed. So you can see from the first paragraph, the inquiry found that throughout the life of the charity's trustee board included 3 members of the same family, which included the chair. And at various times, and following the opening of the inquiry, the 3 related trustees formed the majority of the trustees. The inquiry found that the ability of the trustees to effectively operate and manage the charity and to avoid conflicts of interest was compromised by the fact that 3 of the trustees were connected to one another. So you can see that the issues in here were 3 family members formed the majority of the trustees. Matters were discussed, concluded, and there did not seem to be any separation of personal and corporate or charity interests here. Interestingly, the issue about the funds going to the external agency weren't really brought out in this inquiry. It seems that the external agency was bona fide. They were an external company at arm's length, and none of the trustees were actually members of that organization, so they weren't personally benefiting from the fact that 0.9 million came into the charity and 7.2 million was held back in terms of fees. So that's a strange one. I was wondering, I actually thought when I started to read this that that's where this was going and that they had some interest in this outside body, but that's not the case. So it goes on to say anyway that the charity did not have a conflict of interest policies, and the trustees did not appear to recognise how to identify and manage such conflicts or the importance of doing so. So you can see from that the Charity Commission were very interested in the fact that they were running a charity and they had no separation of personal and charitable interests. There was an issue around the chair receiving £2,000 a month for a property. That wasn't documented. The money was just taken out from the charity account and sent to the chair's personal account with no record of this being agreed or approved or anything. And so you can see how that would have caused a problem for the Charity Commission. I'll just go down to the findings, the result of this and the action that the Charity Commission took. So the outputs from it and the conclusions. So the regulatory action involved a number of little things, but the main thing actually was that the chair was disqualified from acting as a charity or as a charity trustee or in a senior management position in any function of a charity for 15 years. The second trustee was disqualified for 10 years. The third trustee actually says as well, on a voluntary basis, decided that they would not work in a charity or in a charitable organization for 5 years. So you can see that how they can impose sanctions on individuals is quite strong, and they have a lot of powers. Charity Commission, as a regulator, have a lot of powers. They did appoint an interim manager. The charity was actually ultimately dissolved, and obviously the final outturn from this year. And I think they took the proceeds that they had and they shared them across other similar charities in the sector. That's how they divided up the assets and resources that were left in the organisation when this was all completed. Okay, so we'll just go back now to our presentation, and we talked there about the conflict of interest policy and the issues that arose in this particular charity. There's also covered that there, the 15 years, 10 years, and 5 years on that there. The interim manager who was appointed is similar to receiver in credit union. So they have a power to appoint somebody and take away the control of the existing board of directors or committee. So they have a very strong regulatory and enforcement powers. Okay, so example 2 is one in credit unions. So this is an example, again, to show you that across the sector there are implications. So the regulator for credit unions is an arm of the Bank of England, the Prudential Regulatory Authority, and in the UK and in the Republic of Ireland, it's the Central Bank. So it's different regulators, but same type of thing. So again, I'll share with you the outturn from this. Just get this now. So here we have the PRA bans 2 credit unions for governance failures. And again, you can read up on this and you can see exactly what's happened. This was in February 2020. It was a credit union in the UK. So the PRA Prudential Regulation Authority. They basically did an investigation and ended up with some enforcement action in it, and effectively again around the same issues. So it says here the enforcement action related to governance failings and the management of conflicts of interest, including the fact that some of the individuals involved also held positions on an outsourcing company appointed to the credit union. So the credit union was actually put into administration eventually, and it was subsequently liquidated in 2015 for failing to meet the requisite capital requirement. So you can see that between February 18 and February 20, 5 years have gone by before the PRA completed their investigations. So you can see that no matter what sector you're in, regulators look at it take a very detailed and interested look at any conflicts of interest, because they can stop money getting into the charity's bank account, or resources of the charity can be deflected to an individual, and that's against the law and against regulatory oversight rules. So basically, it's important that you understand that if other things go wrong, this can become very public. People are named in press, on websites, and they have to answer to that. And there's obviously an issue as well of reputation risk for any organization where something does go wrong. Okay, so I'll go back to the presentation again. Okay, this example 3 now, this is really more to show you that they're not all high profile cases where conflict of interest is a problem. A lot of conflicts of interest are actually very small or minor, or relatively minor, but they still need to be dealt with. So here's an example here, and it's one that I was party to. I was involved in this. I wasn't on the board of the charity that was involved, but I was involved in the circumstances around this event happening. So the charity chair actually owned a taxi business. At a board meeting, he offered his firm to take staff home from a charity event evening. So he was volunteering to get his taxis and line them up to get people home from this event. He said he would just cover his costs, thus saving the charity and or staff money and ensure that they got home safely. So that's really what he wanted to do, to make sure that the staff got home safely. But he wanted to cover his costs. He wasn't going to do it for free, but he was prepared to put his taxis out there and get them to get people home. So the question is, and you can have a think about this just before I give you the answer, but do you believe that example 3 is a conflict of interest? Just have a think about it. See the details there. He owned a taxi business, offered to take staff home, cover his costs. Have a think. It is a conflict of interest. It is not a conflict of interest, or you're not sure. And mentally take a note of what your answer is there. So I'll now share with you the answer. It actually is a conflict of interest. I mean, what happened in this case is that he did offer to do this at the board meeting. Other board members thought it was a great idea and agreed to it. And that was more or less the end of it. But the issue at stake here was that nobody questioned as to what his costs were. Nobody knew what the costs would be, what costs meant. Was it petrol costs? Was it the time of the taxi driver? Was it wear and tear? Or was it, what was involved in his costs and covering them? So it was all a little bit loose. It did turn out in the end that he did do it, and there was a little bit more detail provided on it. But at the time, this was not treated as a conflict of interest, but yet it clearly was. It was important that everybody was aware that the chair, as the owner of the taxi firm, was going to get some money from it, albeit to cover his costs. But it was important just to understand that that needed to be recorded, reflected, minuted, and basically there was a need to understand what was involved in terms of the money, rather than a loose, he's going to just cover his costs. So that's just an example of a maybe more down-to-earth case where conflicts of interest can cause a problem in charities or even credit unions. It could be the same sort of issue. You can see how they're similar across the different sectors. Okay, so we're now going to just confirm the principles from the courts for reviewing trustee decisions. So the courts have looked at a number of trustee decisions, and these principles have come out from the courts as being things that they will sort of look at when they're trying to make a decision as to whether trustees made the right decision or the wrong decision when somebody's brought a matter to court for the judges to make a decision on. So they have said that the principles that they will review these decisions, there are 7 of them. 1, they expect that trustees must act within their power. 2, they must expect that they will act in good faith and only in the interest of the charity. 3, make sure they're sufficiently informed. They need to take account of all relevant factors, and they need to ignore any irrelevant factors. And number 6, manage conflicts of interest. So very specifically, the courts have said conflicts of interest need to be managed, because there's a legal background to this as well. That it's a company law that trustees and directors of companies must act in the interest of the organization that they work for, and they must separate that from any personal interests. And number 7, they make decisions that are within the range of decisions that a reasonable trustee body could make. Okay, so just a quick summary now of the sources for conflict of interest rules and guidance. So I've covered a few of them here, but I just want to summarize them again, because when you're thinking about conflicts of interest and how to manage them, it's important to know the background to them and what you're trying to cover, and how you're trying to close off the issues that they can cause. So the first place to look is the Constitution. So for charitable companies that are registered as companies, and they're usually limited by guaranteed, registered in Companies House, they'll have a constitution, like a memo and articles of association. So in the memo and articles of association, there will be rules that bind the company, and they are filed in Companies House, and they're filed with the Charity Commission. And they basically form the purpose of the charity, what it's set up for. There's also regulatory rules, which we've looked at some of those through the Charity Commission, and also the Bank of England and Central Bank. They have information they put out there for credit unions, for instance, in terms of how they're managed. And there are standard rules that the Irish League of Credit Unions, and the League produces a set of rules which effectively cover a lot of things that credit unions should be doing, including things like conflicts of interest. There's elements within the rules that cover conflicts of interest, and registering interest in a credit union. It's important that they're followed, as well as the legal aspects and the regulatory aspects. There's governance codes. Some governance codes are produced by the Charity Commission themselves, like in the Republic of Ireland. Other governance codes are produced by a group of charities within the sector, and usually endorsed by the Charity Commission. You've got company law, which we looked at. You've got the accounting rules, or the SORPs, the statements of recommended practice, and you've got your internal conflicts of interest policy. So if you write a policy, that forms part of your rules and guides as to how you should operate your organization. And that conflict of interest policy is usually built around those things that are sitting just above it. Their governance codes, the Constitution, regulatory rules, legal rules. So the policy brings that together. I want to mention now something called a conflict of loyalty. And people aren't quite sure again what a conflict of loyalty means, but a conflict of loyalty is really just a particular type of conflict of interest. It's one in which a trustee's loyalty or duty to another person or organization could prevent the trustee from making a decision only in the best interests of the charity. So an example of that would be where maybe somebody's a member of a golf club or cricket club, sports club of some kind, and the members of that club want to have some dealings with the organization, and the person who's also a member, who's sitting on the board, maybe feels some sort of a loyalty to that person or the organization, and that maybe is conflicting with what they should be doing, which is in the best interest of the organization they're working for, even on a voluntary basis. So it's important that you understand conflicts of loyalty are an issue as well, and things that can affect a person's judgment, or they're something that would affect a decision they would make, and can be influenced by things like conflicts of loyalty. So it's important to understand what they are, and I'll show you how to do that. Okay, so now we're talking about the process or the framework for managing conflicts of interest. So I've set out these 5 steps. I'll just put them up for you to look at. The first one is setting up a register of interest, and I'll show you an example of that. A register of interest is the starting point, because you don't know what conflicts of interest are in your organization unless you know what the personal interests of the individuals are. So the way to capture that is through a register of interest, and I'll show you an example of that and how it's used. Then you complete and circulate that to all board members and senior staff. So you tell people what's in the register of interest, so every board member knows what the interests of all of the other board members are. And when something comes up, even if the person themselves doesn't declare it and say, oh, I have a conflict of interest here, somebody might say, does your son not work for organization A who wants to send us this or buy something from or sell us something, or there's something that we need to this process would allow other board members to understand what's going on right across the whole membership of the board. Develop and approve a conflicts of interest policy, and again make reference to the Constitution. So the Constitution will have elements within that relating to the conflict of interest and what should be done about it. And if you're developing a policy, you should make sure that it aligns with your institution or constitution, and you should have a clear understanding of the elements within the Constitution and make sure they're captured within the conflict of interest policy. And I'll actually show you a sample Constitution and show you how you can do that. Another important aspect here is declare conflicts of interest to every board or committee agenda meeting. So basically, at the start of every meeting, the chair should have shared the agenda, everyone knows what's coming up, and then you should ask everyone present, does anyone have any conflicts of interest based on our agenda tonight? It's up to any member there to turn around and say, oh, item 4, I maybe shouldn't really be involved in that because, or no, actually we've no issues here, and that would be standard practice and important. You maybe already do that, but it's important that you make sure that it happens at every board meeting, that there's a declaration of conflicts of interest. So at the outset, everyone gets a chance to say, item 4, item 3, that's something that maybe I shouldn't be involved in because. And then finally, monitor regularly and review annually. So this is an ongoing process. It's not a matter of getting your conflicts of interest policy, getting your register of interest setups, declaring your interest, at the start of every meeting, and hey, that's it all finished. You do need to monitor this and keep an eye on it, and you would be expected to review this on an annual basis to make sure it's actually working in practice. Okay, so we're going to have a quick look now at the register of interest. There's plenty of free templates available online. So there's plenty of free templates that you can get, and you can edit it and amend to suit your organization. And there's also plenty of sample constitutions. I'll actually show you a register of interest template, one that I use, but there are plenty of free ones on the internet. If you just Google them or Bing them or whatever, you will find a version out there to suit you. So let me just share the one that I use, at least you get an understanding of what goes into it. Okay, so here you have the first part of this, and this is a sample register of interest policy, and basically it is one that a register of interest log, and this is one that is completed by the individual member of the board. So they put their name on it, they confirm their role, they state the date that they joined, and then there's these sections they complete. They detail the current paid positions that they're in, the name of the organization that they work for, and start. And if there's an end date, if it's current, there won't be an end date there, and the role details. So is it themselves in that role, or is it a connected person? And if it's a connected person, I wouldn't recommend you name the person in that necessarily, but if it was the person's spouse or partner or son or daughter or grandfather or cousin or whatever, it'd be important to put that in and understand that it's a conflict of interest of a family member rather than them directly. There's also an opportunity to put in former paid employment, just in case something in from a former job, maybe somebody gets a pension from it or whatever, and that might be an issue for them. And then there's the other current interest in memberships, and this is where the conflicts of loyalty can be captured. So you look at this and see if they're members of golf clubs or sports clubs or professional associations, and if you capture all this information and the person signs it, there's a declaration at the bottom consenting that the information can be used for the purposes described in the organization's conflict of interest policy and for no other purpose. And basically they agree to update this on an annual basis or as things change. So that's the person completes that part of it. And then what happens in most organizations is then that is copied into a register that looks like this. And it's the same layout, same details, just no signature on it. And basically what you do then is you take this, if you've got 10 board members, you get 10 of these completed, you copy the 10 contents of their own form into this document here, and that forms a complete record. So when you go in to look at the register of interests in an organization, you've got all 10 board members all listed and all their details there. And charities are meant to publish that. So that's meant to be published externally, or if people ask for it, you're meant to make that available to people. So that's a way to show the openness and the integrity of the organization by letting the public and anyone else know, any other stakeholders know exactly what the interests of the board members are. So that's what it looks like, a register of interest, and that should be completed by every board member and shared. So I'll just have another look at the policy this time around. So this is a standard constitution. Let's go back in here. And yeah. Yeah, so this is a model article of association from the Charity Commission for England and Wales. And so this tells you, I mean, every charity will have to have a constitution. It'll have to have a basic set of rules that get set up, because you'll need that to register as a charity. You'll need to have a set of memo and articles basically to set up your organization. And this is a model one, and just to show you what's in it. Basically, it's a model one. The charity can adopt this, amend this, and they can add their own elements to it. But you'll see when you go down into it that the articles of association, which are really the directors' rules and how they operate, cover lots of things, but they include things like conflicts of interest. And we just go down to, yeah, there's one on benefits and payments to charity directors and connected persons. So no director or connected person may buy any goods or services from the charity on terms preferential to those applicable to members of the public. There's a few other rules in around that. Interests. The declaration of directors' interests. The director must declare the nature and extent of any interest, direct or indirect, which he or she has in a proposed transaction or arrangement with the charity, or on any transaction or arrangement entered into by the charity which has not previously been declared. So basically it goes on to talk about how the interest must be declared, and then basically what conflict of interest, when they do arise, how they're dealt with. So basically it does say that the conflicted director needs to be absent from the part of the meeting in which he or this discussion or any arrangement or transaction affecting that other organization or person. And the conflicted director does not work or does not vote in any matter, and is not to be counted when considering whether a quorum of directors is present at the meeting. And the unconflicted directors consider it in the interest of the charity to authorize a conflict of interest in the circumstances applying. So the issue at stake here is that this is a standard memo and articles of association published by the Charity Commission. And it's really important to understand that basically these rules that underpin the organization are properly dealt with, properly managed, and properly enacted. So if you've got a charity, you're in an organization, you should look up your constitution as soon as you get back to the office or whenever, if you're not familiar with them, to make sure that basically those rules that are in your constitution are enacted in your organization, and you bring those issues into your conflicts of interest policy. If you feel that these aren't strong enough in your constitution, then you change your constitution, and you have to do that through the Charity Commission. So really important that that's done. Okay. Now, so we've been through here the 5 steps: setting up the register and completing circulating to all board members, developing the conflict of interest policy, and monitor, review, and regularly. Oh yeah, I was going to show you the free template. So I'll just do this now. I'll show you the conflict of interest policy standard template. Okay, so this is a sample conflict of interest policy. It's on the NICFA website. So NICFA is the Northern Ireland Council for Voluntary Action, and basically it is an organisation who supports other charities, and they have a sample conflict of interest policy on their website. So you can see, you can put in your name, you can copy this to a Word document, and there's little options here you can take in or take out, and you can put in your own what your board wants to have in yours, but it's a good starting point for you. You can understand exactly, and this is what should go into one, and then you can edit it and make sure it reflects your organization properly. Okay, so. Okay, and similarly in credit unions, there's you can refer to other constitution directives, if you like. There's a standard rules, which are not click on, the Republic of Ireland are 2019, and it's got details there in the whole handbook and includes things like, it's produced by the Central Bank of Ireland, and it's a whole handbook and has a section on conflict of interest, which again, you can check out yourself. Okay, so when a conflict of interest arises, what are the steps that you would take to deal with them? So the first thing is that you declare your interest. So when something might be a conflict, the person who's potentially conflicted would hold their hand up and say, look, I could be conflicted here. So you can consider removing the conflict. So the board could consider removing it, the person could consider removing conflict. And by removing the conflict, you could be saying that, well, the person who maybe has an association with a golf club or whatever will resign from the golf club, will resign from that organization, or will step back from whatever role they had in that organization that might have been conflicting with their roles. You can just remove it totally and say, well, it's not a conflict anymore. You can manage the conflict, which means that you'll recognize that actually there's an issue here. And how you manage the conflict by and large is to make sure that you don't let the person who has the conflict of interest be involved in the decision-making process around it. Any decisions that are being made on the back of this need to exclude the person who has a conflict. So by that, it means that they would typically exit the meeting if something's being discussed. They would not take part in any decision-making process. They would not be included within any quorum for that. So you would take them out of the picture, let people who are not conflicted make a decision, and then you keep a record of that. Really important, you keep a record of that. You don't leave it that it's up in the air and people aren't sure, what was covered there, and did the person leave the room? You minute that. The person left the room at 10:05 or 18:06 or whatever it is, and you go down through the process, and then at 18:25, after we've made that decision, the person came back into the room. So that's how you record it, and you make sure that it's reflected in your minutes. And if the Charity Commission or anyone wants to have a look at that, it's available to them. Okay, so a summary then of managing conflicts of interest. You check and follow your charity's governing document or your standard rules if you're a credit union, any directors in the commission, any directions from the commission. For example, if your charity has permission to benefit a trustee, other legal rules that apply to your charity, and your conflict of interest policy. So really, it's looking at the background to that and seeing this is the benchmark against which we're working. And then as a minimum then, the rules should require that the conflicted trustee leaves the relevant discussions, does not take part in the decision or vote, and is not counted in the quorum. So really it's important that if you can't get away from having the conflict of interest in the first place, you find a way to manage it. And you make sure that when it's managed, it produces a decision that was not influenced by a person's external interests. So the broader governance framework then, just to talk about that. So I did mention this earlier about the governance codes and company law and regulators, members, and all stakeholders, and risk policy. So really important to contextualize conflicts of interest in this framework. It isn't really standalone. It has all of these influences and things that need to have a bearing on the actual policy that the organization will adopt. And I recommend that you take a broader look at that. Now, as I've laid out here, there's two approaches to it. You can do what I talked about earlier, which have a piecemeal or fragmented or individual way to fix something. So fixing a conflict of interest, and then look at something else. So we'll do conflicts of interest, and then we'll get our risk policy sorted, and then we'll do something on our health and safety and on our codes of conduct for board directors, etc. And you can deal with it as a problem arises. You just say, well, we've dealt with conflicts of interest now. We'll leave everything until something else comes up, and then we'll look at that. You can rely on the governance expert, and this is a problem sometimes in boards, in that there's somebody on the board who has a tendency to understand the issues that sit around corporate governance and how things should be done properly on the board. But there's over-reliance on that person from the rest of the board members, that they rely on that person to keep them right. And I don't think that that's necessarily the best way, because the person themselves could be influenced by somebody else's view, and they should be making their own view on whether something is right or not right. And then, again, assuming everything's okay, we've no problems so far. So therefore, what's the issue? Why do we need to go and fix things if it seems everything's going well? So that's one way of approaching it. I recommend that organizations should really take a more holistic or structured approach to governance and to effective board operations. So by that, I mean, take a step back. I mean, review the conflict of interest policy and the governance more broadly, consider in the context of an effective board. So an effective board is one that manages to achieve its objectives and works very well, has good governance arrangements, etc. Benchmark against best practice. So by that, I mean, looking at your governance codes, looking at your legal rules, looking at best practice in the sector and industry, and how you should be doing things, and review all of those together and then prioritize it. So what I'm saying there is that you take conflicts of interest in the context of other issues, and you then decide where conflicts of interest as a matter for your organization should sit against perhaps other priorities. So I'll show you an example of this. This is something that I've developed, which is a board effectiveness tool. And it's a way to approach conflicts of interest and really governance arrangements generally. And it's a way to structure that. So let me just share that with you now. Okay. So this is a board effectiveness tool. So something I've developed. It's going to be launched in the next couple of weeks. You get a little sneak preview of it here. So effectively, it's a tool that boards can use to, and it's online, a tool that boards can use to review their effectiveness and their governance arrangements. And it's in the form of a questionnaire. So I'll click on that. Just logged out, so bear with me. Second time lucky with the password here. There we go. So how to use the board effectiveness tool. So when you register for this, or when you will register for this, if it's something that your board needs to do, and board effectiveness is something that every board should do periodically. The recommendation is that they should do an external board effectiveness review every 3 years, and annually do an internal one. So you're talking about 2 internal ones, year 1 and year 2, year 3, an external. And the purpose of this really is to take a step back and see how effective the board is at meeting all of its purposes and its objectives and its targets and key performance indicators, etc. So this questionnaire is a way of doing that. So when you register for it, you get a little set of instructions. I'm just going to flick straight through to the tool itself. And it comes in the form of 7 sections. And these 7 sections are, well, section 1 is board roles and responsibilities. Section 2 is the board composition and development. And that includes aspects of diversity and equality. Operating the board is number 3. Strategic leadership and performance is number 4. Audit, risk and financial management, number 5. 6 is legal compliance, and 7 is external relationships. So there are 7 sections that the board would collectively get together to review. And once they're reviewed, they will be able to get an understanding of what the gaps and maybe the weaknesses and the areas that they've got to look at in their organization. And I'll just show you how this works. So you can see that there's a number of questions in each section. Now you can see there's only 1 question in each of these sections. That's in the process of being uploaded to this website. They've all been written, they're all ready to go. It's just a matter of getting them uploaded, and I'll be doing that over the next week or so. But in section 1, which is complete, there's board roles and responsibilities. And there's a series of questions here, as you can see. Going down there, question 4, 5, 6, and basically these are questions around the roles and responsibilities of board members. So the board collectively will get together to review these questions. For instance, question 1, is the role of the board clearly defined? So does this role know, does this board know what its exact role is? And the question is a straightforward one, and the answer is yes or no. If the answer is yes, because everyone knows exactly what they're doing here, then that's fine. If the answer is no, leave it as no, then that means that the board probably needs to sit and think about how to define its role better, share it with the members, and make sure then that it's understood and that that's rolled out over the next period of time. So question 2, have all board members been provided with a copy of the governing document? So these questions are about the role. Does the board understand its role, and do the members understand their individual responsibilities? But I want to take you down to question 8. So is there a written conflicts of interest policy, including conflicts of loyalty, within the organisation that is in line with the governing document and best practice? So this tool asks the question about the conflict of interest, if you have it in place. If you don't, you can say no. If you have it in place, it's operating, then it's fine. You say yes. If it's not, you leave it there. It then goes on to ask, as we've covered in the webinar so far, are there written procedures in place approved by the board for dealing with real and potential conflicts of interest, including conflicts of loyalty? If the answer to that question is no, you say no. If it's yes again, you say yes. So again, we're just going to leave it at no for now. Number 10, is there a register of interest maintained for all board members and relevant staff that is regularly updated? And then at the outset of every board meeting, our board members are asked to declare any real or potential conflict of interest in relation to any agenda item. It goes on to talk about gifts and hospitality, which can be a problem in organizations. If a member receives some sort of hospitality, the likes of, cup final tickets or, match tickets to something, or theatre tickets, or a dinner or a meal out or whatever, that can conflict an individual because they feel beholden to the people who gave it to them. So actually operating a gifts and hospitality policy and having a register for gifts and hospitality is important as well. So basically, what happens is you would answer all the questions in each section. I've taken the opportunity to answer all of the questions bar 1, which is question 5. Has the board formally reviewed role profiles for key post holders in the last 3 years? I'm just going to say no to that. Now, when I say no to that, all of the questions and all of the sections have been answered. As I say, there's only one on each of those, and I've just set this up for demonstration purposes. So this pops up now, generate report. So when I click generate report and download it and name it, whatever, and then open it up. I'll share this with you now. So there you go. Okay. So what do you get then, having answered all the questions in the questionnaire? There's about 125, maybe 130, depending on whether you've answered yes or no to certain questions, and maybe some that mightn't be relevant. But basically, you get a board effectiveness action plan. This is just a test one that I've done for the purposes of today. And you can see there's instructions and guidance on how it works. But ultimately, just take time now to show you what the plan itself looks like. So under board effectiveness action plan, we looked at section 1, the board roles and responsibilities. And because we answered no to certain questions, there's not action. So we go down to question 8, which is one of the ones we said no to. Develop a written conflicts of interest, including conflicts of loyalty policy for board members and staff that's in line with the governing document and best practice, and present it to the board for approval. So you get an opportunity then to prioritize that, high, medium, or low. Let's say that's a high priority for this organization. With me. Well, high priority for that, and let's say it's going to be completed by Harriet, and they're going to do that by the 31st of December. Okay, and current status is an opportunity to update the plan periodically if people want to use this as a reporting mechanism. So effectively what you've got here now, having answered all the questions in the questionnaire in a more holistic and structured fashion, is you've now got a whole series of actions. Under each section, there's 21 from section 1, There's only one in each of these other sections, but there's questions where the board has said, we don't have that, that's not in place. And you can now decide how to prioritize them, because you've got other issues that are important as well and urgent. And you might decide that actually, having looked at this year, well, it is a high priority. Well, it might be a high priority on its own. In the context of other actions that we've got to do, it's a medium priority, because we're not going to get this done really until the end of December because of a resources issue, or with other priorities, or funding issues, or whatever it is, or something else has to be done. So the way this works then is it gives you and the board the opportunity to consider the likes of conflicts of interest in a framework, if you like, for broader issues that need to be looked at by the board. Okay, so that's how it works. It's pretty comprehensive. That the governance codes that this is built against, includes key areas of corporate governance that the board need to be thinking about, including the conflicts of interest that we've looked at. There's also a section on risk management. There's sections on finance, sections on code of conduct, and a whole range of different things that's really important that the board takes a view on, and make sure that they're working to the highest standards possible. So we'll back now to the presentation. Okay, so launch date Monday the 18th of October. That's the intention, that this will be available, and I'll be sharing some details with that of that with you as well following this webinar. Or if you're interested in it, you can contact me. So the framework for managing conflict of interest that we talked about, just to go through those again: setting up the register, completing and circulating to board members and staff, developing and approving the policy, adding declare conflicts of interest to the agenda, and then monitor regularly and review annually. And that's the end of the webinar. That's covered all of the parts of it that I think are really important for you to get a good understanding of, and be able to take away from this webinar today, and actually begin to do something in your organization. For anyone who's interested in the board effectiveness tool, you'll find details at my website, www.addmorebusiness.com. As I said, it hasn't quite launched yet, but that's where you'll find it when it does launch. And I'd just like to thank everybody for that. The following webinar, which is coming up at the end of October, will be available to those who are interested in it, and I'll also be sharing details for that, or you can find details of that through my website or through Eventbrite. And that's just a quick reminder of the free webinars that are coming up. They're going to be on the last Wednesday of every month. The next topic, as I say, is managing risks, essential for voluntary boards, 27th of October at 10:30. And there's a little link to the tickets as well. So again, I'd like to thank everybody for taking the time to join me today. And if you have any queries at all, you can contact me through my email address, which was on that, tony@addmorebusiness.com. More than happy to have a chat with you if you've got particular issues within your own charity. And thank you again.